My name is Dex Halloran, and the week the sky cracked open over our city, I was in my basement soldering a capacitor that would not hold. That is the part nobody tells you about an invasion. It does not begin with sirens. It begins with you wearing a Starfleet sweatshirt with mustard on the sleeve, hunched over a workbench, swearing at a piece of equipment that ought to work and does not. The world goes on around a man like me whether the world is ending or not. I had a furnace that ticked. I had a single bare bulb. I had a half-eaten sandwich on a paper plate and a notebook full of equations I had been chasing since I was 19 years old. I had Ray upstairs in my living room drinking my beer and watching cartoons at full volume, because Ray Grabowski did not have a television of his own anymore, on account of having put his fist through it. That was my life the day before. A leaking workshop in a leaking neighborhood in a city that had been leaking for 40 years. Steel mills closed. Tanneries closed. The lake gone gray. Old men on stoops who had outlived their factories and their wives. I was 31 years old and I was building in that basement a portable directed energy weapon I called the Battle Pack, a shoulder rig with a power cell the size of a paint can, capable on paper of cutting through plate steel at 40 meters. I had no buyer for it. I had no client. I had built it because I was the kind of man who built things, and because I had not been able to ask Julie Merck to a movie in 7th grade and had been compensating ever since. I had 3 friends. That is generous accounting. I had Ray, who was my upstairs neighbor and who had been my friend since we were 12, before his temper had eaten the rest of his life. I had Seed, an English transplant with green hair and a studded jacket who fronted a 3-chord band called the Bladder Infections, and who treated my basement like a rehearsal space whether I invited him or not. And I had a man we would meet later, a man in a pith helmet and a khaki jacket, who in any sensible week I would have crossed the street to avoid. That basement, that capacitor, that paper plate, that was the world before. The crack came at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I felt it first in my back molars, the way you feel a transformer about to fail. Then the bulb above my head went bright white and stayed there, brighter than tungsten had any business being, and the air smelled like a struck match. I climbed the stairs. Ray was on his feet in front of my window, which is something Ray almost never did, and he said, without turning around, "Dex, get up here. The sky is wrong." The sky was wrong. There was a shape in it the size of a baseball stadium, low enough to throw a shadow over 4 city blocks, and it was not moving the way a cloud moves or the way an aircraft moves. It hung. It corrected. It hung again. It had the unsettled stillness of a man trying not to be noticed in a room he had just entered. The underside of it was matte and dull and ribbed, like the belly of some long lake fish, and a green light blinked along its keel at intervals that were almost a pattern and almost not. Ray said, "Those are not ours." I said, "No." He said, "What are they here for?" And I said, with what I now understand was the worst guess I have made in my life, probably nothing, probably observation, probably they'll just hang there a while. The first transmission punched through every television and radio in the city 90 seconds later. It was not threatening. That is the thing I want a younger man to understand. They did not threaten us. They announced, in a flat male voice with strange long pauses between syllables, that they were the survey arm of a body called the Munchabite Collective, and that there was, in our city, an item belonging to them, an object of considerable value. They had narrowed its location to roughly 1 square mile of our downtown. They requested, the voice said, that the citizens within that square mile remain still and offer no resistance. They would retrieve the object and depart. The voice repeated this 3 times with the same long pauses and then went silent. My square mile, my basement. Ray turned to me very slowly. "Dex," he said, "what did you build down there?" I want to say, in fairness to myself, that I did not know. The Battle Pack used a power cell I had bought through a defense surplus channel that did not ask many questions and did not give many answers. The cell ran cold and dense, and outputted on a frequency I had not been able to find documentation for in any journal. I had assumed it was a black-budget prototype that had walked out of a Sandia loading dock in some retiree's lunchbox. I had assumed wrong. It was theirs. The whole project, the whole basement, the whole half-eaten sandwich, was sitting on top of something I did not own. I told Ray. Ray took it about the way Ray takes anything. He stood very still for about 4 seconds, and then he picked up my coffee table and broke it across his own knee, and then he went into the kitchen and drank a beer in one pull, and then he came back and said, all right, so we are not giving it to them. I said, Ray, they have a ship the size of a stadium. He said, Dex, I do not give a single solid damn what they have. I have lived in this neighborhood since I was 8 years old, and nobody is coming down out of the sky to tell me to be still in my own house. Not them. Not anybody. We are not giving them anything. That was Ray's whole worldview in 2 sentences in my living room, while the shape outside hung in the air and corrected itself again. He had a list of grievances about the world that ran longer than my arm, and most of them were fair, and all of them had taught him exactly one response. He had learned somewhere along the way that you do not give ground, not to a landlord, not to a foreman, not to a court, not to a wife, not to anything. That instinct had wrecked his life 6 different ways. It was, in the next 7 days, going to save what was left of mine. Seed came over an hour later through my basement door, which he had a key to that I had never given him. He had his guitar slung across his back and a 6-pack under one arm. He said, lads, did you see the bloody thing in the sky? This is the most exciting thing that's happened in this rubbish city in 10 years. And I said, Seed, they are looking for my basement. And Seed stopped halfway down the stairs and said, well then, right, let's have a look at it. He sat down on a milk crate, opened a beer, and stared at the battle pack for a long time. Then he said, Dex, can this guitar of mine be modded to run on that cell of yours? I said, Seed, your guitar is a guitar. He said, my guitar is whatever I plug into it, mod it. Seed had a Telecaster knockoff with a homemade pickup that he had built out of an old microwave transformer and a great deal of poor judgment. He had been telling me for 2 years that his amplifier could, under the right circumstances, knock a bird out of a tree. I had laughed at him. I want the record to show I had laughed at him. That night, with the ship still hanging over downtown and the radio repeating the announcement on a loop, I sat down with his guitar in my lap and started cutting into it with a pair of dikes, because I could not think of anything else to do that did not involve standing in my front yard waiting to die. The first ground team came down the next morning. There were 6 of them. They came through my front door, which they did not knock on. They came through my front door by removing the door, which they did with a tool that looked like a length of black coral. They did not run. They did not shout. They moved at a deliberate, almost respectful pace, the way men move through a museum. They had 4 arms each. They had heads that sat too low between their shoulders, almost between their collarbones, with eyes set wide and high so that the face read, at first glance, as a kind of pale, flat blank. Their skin had the sheen of something that had been wet and dried badly. They smelled, in close quarters, like copper and like a refrigerator that had been left unplugged. I will not forget that smell. The thing I want to say about those 6 is that they did not feel like people. I have been in the same room with men who wanted to kill me. I have been in the same room with men who had killed before and would kill again. There is a current that comes off such a man. The Munchabites had no current. They had inventory. They moved through my house the way a man moves through a storage unit he has rented and forgotten about, opening drawers, removing items, setting them down, moving on. When the lead won, I learned later that this was a rank marker called a Munchabib, which was both a name and a job, found me in the kitchen. It did not threaten me. It said, in that flat male voice from the broadcast, the object is in this structure. Indicate the object. We will remove the object. You may remain. That was its pitch. That was its full diplomatic offering. You may remain. The way you might tell a houseplant it may remain on a windowsill. I told it the object was in the basement. I had to. Ray was upstairs on the second floor with a baseball bat, and Seed was in my back shed with the modified guitar, and we had agreed on a thing, and the thing started with letting them through the front door. The Munchabib went down my basement stairs. The other 5 waited in my kitchen, arrayed at corners, in the way of men who had been trained to array themselves at corners. They watched the windows. They did not watch me. That was their first mistake. The battle pack on my workbench was a feint. I had spent the night replacing its power cell with a wrapped brick of household batteries, and a single capacitor wired to discharge straight back into the rig at the first attempt to lift it. The real cell was already strapped to Seed's chest under his leather jacket, in the back shed, 60 feet across the yard, where he was tuning the modified guitar against the side of a refrigerator. When the Munchabib reached for the battle pack and lifted it off the bench, the capacitor went, and the basement filled with a flash of light I felt against my eyelids from the kitchen, and a sound I felt in my breastbone. The 5 Munchabites in my kitchen turned all together, in one unit, toward the basement door. Seed hit the cord. I have tried in the years since to describe what that cord was. It was not music. It was a pressure event. It was the inside of a transformer shorting against a bell. It came out of the back shed and rolled across my yard and came in through my kitchen window, and the kitchen window came in with it. The 5 Munchabites went down, not killed. Stunned, their inner ears or whatever passed for them shaken loose by a frequency Seed had picked by accident 2 years before in a parking lot when he had blown out a bird. They folded onto my linoleum like badly stacked laundry. Ray came down from the second floor with the bat. I want to say here that I tried to stop him. I did not. I want to say it because it is the decent thing to say, and the decent thing to say is, often, a lie. Ray went through those 5 Munchabites with a Louisville Slugger in the kitchen where I had eaten cereal that morning, and he did it in about 90 seconds, and when he was done, he was breathing through his teeth, and there was alien on the cabinets and on the refrigerator door and on the front of his Bears jersey, and he looked at me over the wreckage and said, "Dex, we are going to need to leave this house." We left the house. We took the real battle pack and the guitar and a duffel bag of canned food, and we went out the back through the alley and across 2 yards and into the rusted municipal garage behind the old brewery, where Ray's cousin had once worked, and we sat down on the cold concrete to think. The radio in the garage office was still broadcasting their announcement, but the pauses between syllables had gotten longer. I think now that they had not expected to lose 6. I think the math of their occupation had not had a column for 6. We were in that garage for about 40 minutes before Jacob found us. I had never met Jacob Spaulding in my life. He came in through the side door with a pith helmet on his head and a bolt-action rifle slung over his shoulder, and a look in his eye that I have since only ever seen on certain old men in certain VFW halls. He was somewhere north of 50. He had a thick mustache. He had the bearing of a man who had been waiting his entire adult life for the precise occasion to walk into a brewery garage in a pith helmet, and who now believed his moment had come. He took us in, me, Ray with alien on his jersey, Seed with his guitar, and he said, in a voice with an accent that could not decide what continent it was from, "Gentlemen, I have been hunting these creatures across this district for 11 hours. I have killed 2. I require allies. Are you allies?" Ray said, "What is wrong with this man?" I said, "Mr. Spaulding." He said, "Jacob." I said, "Jacob, you have killed 2 of them." He said, "By stealth, from a tree, with the moss and nagant. They are not difficult to kill if you stay above their sight line. Their eyes are placed for prey on the ground, not for predators in the canopy. I assume you have made a similar observation." I had not made a similar observation. I had been hiding in a basement. The thing about Jacob Spaulding is that he was, as Ray would later put it, 3/4 out of his mind, but the 1/4 that was still in his mind had spent 40 years reading books about animals. He looked at the Munchabites the way Ray looked at landlords and the way Seed looked at amplifiers. He saw a thing he understood. He saw, in those low-set heads and those 4 arms, an animal, and animals he knew. We took him. We did not have the luxury of being choosy. The grind started that afternoon and ran 6 days, and I will not be able to give every hour of it the attention it deserves. Other ships came down. Other Munchabib teams came through other front doors. Across the city the announcement kept repeating, the pauses kept lengthening, and the body count on both sides began to climb. We learned, by trial and by funeral, what the collective was and how to hurt it. They were a hive. Not in the way an ant hive is a hive. They were a memory hive. Each Munchabib carried, in some organ at the base of its skull, a piece of every other Munchabib's experience. When one of them learned a thing, all of them learned it within a few hours. When one of them died, the others felt the absence of that knowledge, the gap where a piece of their shared mind had been, and they reorganized around the gap with the efficiency of water finding a new channel. This is why their initial losses to us, and to a few other scattered cells of fighters across the city, did not stop them. They simply updated. They knew by the second day that the chord from Seed's guitar would stun them, and they began wearing thin films of gel inside their ear cavities to dampen it. They knew, by the third day, that Ray Grabowski liked to come downstairs swinging, and they began posting one of their number at the head of any stairwell with a directed weapon angled upward. They learned. They learned faster than any human enemy I have ever heard described in any war. But there were things they could not learn. They could not learn Ray. I do not mean they could not learn what he would do. I mean they could not learn what he was. Ray's anger was not strategic. It was not even, most days, useful. It was a feature of his nervous system, the way a tremor is a feature, and it operated on inputs that had nothing to do with the situation in front of him. On the 4th day, in the parking lot of a closed grocery, 3 Munchabites had Ray in a crossfire, and the lead one was speaking to him in that flat male voice. And what tipped Ray over the edge and into the moment that killed those 3 was not the crossfire. It was that one of them had stepped on his foot. He told me this later. He said, "Dex, I would have stood there and let them shoot me, but the son of a bitch stepped on my foot." He went through them with a length of rebar he had picked up from a construction site, and the hive had no entry in its inventory for a man who reacted to a crossfire with patience and to a stepped-on foot with murder. And so they died confused, which is, I have come to think, a fair description of how a hive dies when it meets a human. They could not learn Seed. Seed did not, in the technical sense, fight. He played. He treated the entire occupation as a venue. He had 3 songs in his book that I had heard him play 100 times each in my basement, and on the second night in the parking lot behind a bowling alley with the real battle pack cell strapped to his chest. He played all 3 of those songs at full volume to a crowd of about 40 Munchabites who had come to investigate the sound. By the end of the second song, they were on the asphalt with their 4 arms folded over their low-set heads. By the end of the third song, his drummer, a kid named Wesley who had been with the band for 6 months, was a black streak on the brick wall of the bowling alley because the Munchabites had brought a directed weapon and used it before the chord landed. Seed did not stop playing. He played through it. He played the rest of the set with Wesley on the wall and his own hands shaking, and the cell on his chest at full draw. And when the last Munchabite went down, he set the guitar across his shoulders like a yoke and walked back to the garage and sat down on the concrete and did not speak for 2 hours. Then he asked me to help him bury what was left of Wesley. We buried what was left of Wesley behind the brewery, in the kind of grave you dig with a piece of corrugated steel because you do not have a shovel. The hive had no entry for a man who would play a 3rd song while his drummer was being killed. They had no model for grief that did not stop you. They could not learn Jacob. Jacob was, I now believe, the one of us they understood least. Ray's rage at least had a shape they could read. Seed's noise was a frequency they could measure. Jacob was a man in a pith helmet using a 100-year-old rifle from the top of a water tower, and he was, in his own private interior weather, having the time of his life. He did not hate the Munchabites. He admired them. He spoke about them at night, around the kerosene heater in the garage, as though they were a particularly elegant species of leopard. He kept a notebook. He sketched their bone structure. He told us on the 5th night that he had identified the exact angle at which their throat cartilage was thinnest, and that a round placed there at 30 meters or under would drop one without alerting the others. And Ray looked at me across the kerosene heater and said, "Dex, this lunatic is the most valuable man in this city." And he was. He was. The Hive could update against ambushes and against rage and against frequency weapons, but it could not update against an old British amateur naturalist in a pith helmet who treated the war as a field study, and who took his shots from elevations the Munchabites had not yet learned to look at. He killed 11 of them in 3 days, from rooftops and water towers and one church steeple. He took no satisfaction in the killing. He took satisfaction in the technique. That is a distinction I doubt the collective had ever encountered in a thinking species. And they could not learn me. I have thought about this part the longest. I was not the fighter of the 4 of us. I was the engineer. I was the one in the back of the garage at 3 in the morning with a soldering iron and a flashlight clamped between my teeth. The Munchabite collective, I came to understand, was excellent at modeling combat. It was excellent at modeling movement and weapons and supply. What it could not model was a man who built things for no reason. The battle pack had not been built for them. It had not been built for any war. It had been built because I was 31 years old and lonely and good with my hands, and had no one to call on a Saturday night. The cell at its heart, the cell they had come a measurable fraction of forever to retrieve, had ended up in my basement because I was the kind of man who would pay cash for a surplus part I did not understand on the chance that I might one day figure it out. The Hive could not get its arms around that. It assumed throughout the occupation that we had been training. It assumed we were a cell of state operators. It assumed our basement was a facility. It looked at 4 men in a brewery garage and saw, in its inventory, 4 soldiers. It never saw what was actually there, which was a scientist, an alcoholic, a punk rocker, and a lunatic, none of whom had any business being alive past Wednesday. That blindness was what we worked with. The turn came on the 6th night. We had identified by then the Munchabite command ship, not the stadium-sized vessel that hung over downtown, which was a relay, but a smaller, denser ship parked in a parking structure on the north side of the river. Jacob had spotted it through a pair of binoculars from a grain elevator. He said, "Gentlemen, that is the throne. They are running their inventory from there. If we go through that, we go through the lot of them." Seed said, "How do we go through it?" I said, "The battle pack, the real one, at full draw, through the floor of the structure into the keel. If the cell is what they say it is, it will cut." Ray said, "Who carries it?" There was a silence around the kerosene heater. The battle pack at full draw was a one-shot proposition. The cell would, by my best math, deliver one sustained beam of about 11 seconds before it gutted itself. 11 seconds was enough, by my best math, to cut through about 4 feet of any material I had data on. The keel of the command ship, by Jacob's best guess from the grain elevator, was about 3 feet of layered alloy. The math closed. Barely. The man who carried it would not be coming back. The cell, at full draw, would not be survivable from within 4 meters. The battle pack's rig was not designed to be dropped and run from. It was designed to be worn through the firing, because dropping it broke the focusing array, and a broken focusing array meant a flash and not a cut. Ray said it before any of us. Ray said, "I will carry it." Seed said, "No." Ray said, "Seed, sit down." Seed said, "Ray, you do not get to do that." Ray said, "Seed, I am going to do that." And then Ray turned to me, and he said the thing I will carry to my own grave. He said, "Dex, I have lived in this neighborhood since I was 8 years old. I have not done one useful thing in 23 years. I have broken every chair I have ever owned. I have lost every job I have ever had. I have outlived my wife, who left me, and my dog, who I think I scared to death, and my own father, who told me on his last day that I had wasted my whole life on being angry. I have been waiting, Dex. I have been waiting for one thing that the anger would be good for. And it turns out the thing is that I can walk a 4-foot by 2-foot rig into a parking garage and hold a button down for 11 seconds without flinching. I can do that. I am the only one of us who can do that. You let me do it. I let him do it. We went up to the parking structure on the 6th night, the 4 of us, through alleys and across rooftops, with Jacob in the lead and his rifle out, and Seed behind him with the guitar at his hip and the modified pickup live, and Ray in the middle with the battle pack on his back and the cell warm against his spine, and me at the rear with a flashlight and a screwdriver, and the manual I had written for the rig in my own handwriting in case anything went wrong. There were moonchabites in the structure. There were a lot of moonchabites in the structure. Jacob took the first 2 from a stairwell landing, throat shots, both clean, neither of the others on their team turning fast enough to register. Seed took the next group with a cord that brought down a section of ceiling tile and put 6 of them on the concrete. Ray walked through them. He did not run. He walked in his Bears jersey, with the rig on his back and the cell humming at his shoulder blades, and the moonchabites who were still standing parted for him, not out of respect, but out of confusion, because the Hive had not yet rendered a model for a man walking calmly through a corridor of his own dying enemies, and by the time it did, Ray was already at the keel. The keel of the command ship was a flat, dull silver surface in the middle of the 3rd floor of the parking structure, set into the concrete as though the ship had grown there. I do not know how it had landed. I do not to this day fully understand the propulsion. Ray looked at it for about 2 seconds. Then he looked back over his shoulder at the 3 of us at the stairwell, and he said the last thing I ever heard him say. He said, "Tell my mother I was finally good for something." And then he leveled the battle pack at the keel and held the button down. 11 seconds is a long time. I want anyone listening to understand that. 11 seconds is a long time to hold any button down. 11 seconds with a directed energy cell at full draw is longer. The light from the rig filled the parking structure all the way down to the basement levels. It went up through the ceiling. It went up through the floor of the ship. It went up through whatever was on the other side of that floor, which was, as we later established, the central memory organ of the Moonchabib command cohort, in a room the Hive had assumed was unreachable by anything any human being could possibly possess. The ship came apart from the inside. I cannot tell that part the way it deserves. I was running by then with Seed under one arm and Jacob under the other, down a stairwell that was filling with smoke, and there was a sound from above us that I have never been able to find a comparison for, the sound of an entire shared mind realizing, all at once, that it had been wrong about a thing it could not be wrong about and survive. Across the city in real time, every Moonchabib still standing went down. Some of them died on their feet. Some of them fell quietly. The relay over downtown lost its lights. The broadcast on the radio stopped mid-syllable, in the middle of a pause, and never resumed. Ray did not come down the stairwell. I went back up after. When the smoke had cleared enough to climb, I went up with Jacob behind me with his rifle and Seed behind him with the guitar across his back. There was nothing on the 3rd floor of the parking structure to find. The rig was gone. The cell was gone. Ray was gone. The keel of the ship was a black hole through 3 floors of concrete. We stood at the edge of it for a long time. Seed took off his jacket and laid it on the ground at the edge of the hole, because he did not know what else to do with it. And Jacob took off his pith helmet and held it against his chest, and stood the way a soldier stands at a grave he is not allowed to dig. And I sat down on the concrete with my back against a support pillar, and I did not move for a long time. That was 6 days in, and there was a 7th day. And on the 7th day there were other ships in other cities. And we went, the 3 of us, where we were asked to go, because there was no one else in the country who had killed a Moonchabib and lived, and because Jacob had a notebook full of throat measurements and Seed had a guitar that worked, and I had, in my head, the schematics for a rig I now knew how to build again from junk parts. I do not want to talk about the rest of the war. Other men have told it. They have told it with more medals than I have and more correct names of cities. I am telling you the part that nobody else can tell, which is the part in my basement and in the brewery garage, and in the parking structure on the north side of the river, where 4 men who had no business in any war fought a hive that had no entry for them and won, at the cost of one of us, because the hive could not understand a man who walked calmly into a room he was not coming out of. I think about Ray every day. I think about him at 4 in the afternoon, around the time the sky cracked, because that is when the light in my kitchen still goes a certain way that reminds me of his Bears jersey on the back of one of my chairs. I think about him when I solder. I think about him when I see a baseball bat. I think about him when I hear a chord at volume from a passing car. And I think about him most of all when I hear the announcement, on certain late-night broadcasts now, that the Moonshabite Collective has, through diplomatic channels, formally requested that the Terran nation-states keep his name out of their treaty negotiations, because the Hive cannot, by its own admission, file him. They cannot file him. They could not file him when he was alive, and they cannot file him now. That is what I want a younger man to understand about us, about what we are. We do not file. We are messy in the basement. We are angry in the kitchen. We are loud in the parking lot. We are calm in the corridor on our last walk. We build things we cannot afford for women we cannot speak to. We hate ourselves and each other, and we go anyway. The Hive came down out of the sky with a model for us, and the model was wrong, and the model has been wrong every time anyone has ever tried to build one, because there is no model. There is only the 4 of us in a brewery garage with a kerosene heater and bad coffee, and a job that needed doing. I keep a chair empty at my kitchen table. I do not put anything on it. I do not let anyone sit in it. There is a Bears jersey folded across the back of it with a stain on the front that I have never washed out and never will. The furnace ticks. The bulb hums. The lake outside is still gray. And every once in a while, when the wind is right off the water, I sit down across from that chair and I raise a glass, and I do not say anything, because there is nothing left to say that he did not already say in the parking structure. I just sit, and I drink. And I remember that the man in that jersey, on the worst day of his life, walked calmly through a corridor he was not coming out of and held a button down for 11 seconds and saved a world that had never once been kind to him. That is the part the Hive could not file. That is the part no Hive ever will.